A judge mocked a young black lawyer in open court. What the lawyer did next made the entire room fall silent, including the judge himself. The courtroom was as still as a chapel when Malcolm Reed stood, polished in a tailored navy blue suit. Every thread on him spoke of quiet discipline. His briefcase clicked gently as he opened it. No theatrics, just purpose. His expression remained calm, a serenity that belied the storm that had just passed over him. For the third time in under an hour, the presiding judge, Judge Walter Hargrove, had interrupted him mid-sentence, this time to correct a legal definition Malcolm had not actually misstated. "If you're quite finished posturing, counselor," the judge said, his voice coated with polite venom, "we can get back to real arguments." Murmurs stirred through the gallery, not loud but present enough to notice. Malcolm looked up at the bench, not defiantly, but directly. He didn't flinch. He didn't bite back. He simply nodded and moved on. But beneath the stillness of his features, the words lodged like splinters. Not because they were new, but because they were familiar. He had worked for years to be here, graduated top of his class, earned respect with a methodical mind and an unwavering sense of justice. And yet, standing in this very courtroom, all it took was the wrong tone, the wrong assumption, and the wrong man in a robe to paint him as less than. Malcolm didn't push back. He didn't raise his voice. Instead, when he resumed, his line of questioning shifted. Quietly, carefully, he turned to the witness and asked, "Were you employed at Griffin Manufacturing in 1997? The opposing counsel blinked. The judge squinted. "Counselor, this case pertains to events from 2023. Let's not waste the court's time with irrelevant history." Malcolm held up a document, old and slightly faded, encased in a plastic sleeve. "I believe, Your Honor, the court will find this history instructive." The judge gestured impatiently. "Proceed." One by one, Malcolm began referencing pieces from an old civil case, obscure, forgotten, yet filed in the same courthouse. He cited witness statements, a defendant's profile shockingly similar to the current case, and finally, an excerpt from the closing argument made by the defense attorney back then. He turned toward the gallery, now quiet, curious. "This is from the transcript of Simmons versus Griffin Manufacturing, 1998. A case argued passionately and brilliantly by a young Walter Hargrove." A gasp rolled through the seats like a soft wave. The judge's jaw tensed. His hand froze. Atop his gavel, Malcolm continued, voice steady. "Justice means speaking up when it's inconvenient." Malcolm read aloud, eyes now locked with the judge. "And standing up for those who've been silenced, even if your voice shakes." The I quote hung in the air like incense. "You said those words," Malcolm added quietly. "I first read them in law school. They were why I chose this path. They were yours." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was thick, electric. Even the opposing counsel had stopped writing, hand hovering in midair over his notes. A bailiff shifted in place. The sound of a ticking clock in the courtroom suddenly felt deafening. Judge Hargrove didn't speak. He simply stared down at the transcript as if it were a photo of a version of himself he hadn't seen in decades. The tension in his shoulders slackened. The lines around his eyes softened, not out of defeat but recognition. Malcolm waited, not for approval, but to allow space for the weight of truth. Finally, without meeting anyone's gaze, the judge simply gave a single nod. "Continue," he said, his voice lower, quieter. The trial resumed with no more interruptions. Malcolm continued his argument with poise and conviction. The jury, once passive, now leaned forward with attention sharpened by respect. 2 days later, the verdict came in. Unanimous. The courtroom buzzed, but Malcolm showed little celebration. For him, justice wasn't a moment. It was a movement. A long, winding road paved by those who came before him and lit, now by voices he had helped reignite. Outside, as the sky dimmed and flashes from reporters' cameras lit the courthouse steps, one question was thrown louder than the others. "Mr. Reed, how did you stay calm when the judge was so openly critical of you?" Malcolm paused. His client, now smiling through grateful tears, stood beside him. He adjusted his tie, looked toward the horizon, and replied, "Dignity isn't silence. It's knowing when to speak. So the truth echoes louder than hate." No one said a word after that. Because sometimes justice doesn't roar. It whispers. And that whisper can change everything. The heavy oak doors of Courtroom 3B creaked open slowly, letting in a streak of golden afternoon sunlight that cut through the still air like a silent warning. The room, paneled with dark cherry wood and lined with the cold gaze of history framed in portraits of judges past, stirred as people turned their heads. In walked Malcolm Reed. He was not the largest man in the room, nor the loudest. But when Malcolm entered, he did so with the quiet command of someone who knew exactly who he was and what the world thought of him. 33 years old, skin the color of smooth obsidian, his close-cropped hair lined to precision. He wore a charcoal gray suit that didn't scream for attention, but demanded respect nonetheless. A deep blue tie, almost navy, rested like a stripe of steel across his crisp white shirt. There was something in the way he moved. His gait was deliberate, his shoulders square, each step a message. "I have earned this ground I walk on." He paused, briefly at the plaintiff's table, setting his leather briefcase down with practiced ease before helping his client into the seat beside him. Every motion was controlled, but not stiff, like a pianist just before the concert begins. But it was Malcolm's eyes that held the most power. Dark, steady, thoughtful, eyes that had seen too much and said too little. Behind them lived old battles, late nights poring over case files in underfunded libraries, stinging words hurled in elevators and boardrooms, the tight, polite smiles that barely masked suspicion. And through all of it, Malcolm had learned not just to endure, but to maneuver, to outthink, to outlast. Today, however, was not about him. It was about Cynthia Walters, a middle-aged black woman seated beside him, clutching a worn purse like a lifeline. She had worked 22 years at East Grove Industries until the company, one of the largest manufacturing employers in the state, terminated her without warning. The official reason? Downsizing. But Malcolm had dug deeper. The downsizing had affected 3 employees. All 3 were black. And the promotions that followed? All white. The case had made waves. It was civil rights litigation in a city that claimed to be post-racial, in a courtroom presided over by a judge with a track record of pragmatism, a word that meant something very different depending on who you asked. The defense was, backed by money and reputation, their lead counsel a silver-haired, Harvard-educated veteran who once shared cigars with state senators. Malcolm knew what they saw when they looked at him. The judge, the jury, the press, even some of his peers. A young black lawyer with too much ambition, stepping into a storm that should have drowned him. The unspoken assumption hung in the air like humidity. He would falter. He would fold. Maybe not today, but soon. He was here on borrowed credibility, but Malcolm wasn't here to prove them wrong. He was here to prove something far more dangerous, that he belonged. As the courtroom filled, the low murmur of voices drifted around him like static. He opened his file, glancing through the notes not because he needed to, but because ritual brought clarity. Across the aisle, the opposing counsel leaned in and whispered something to his assistant. Laughter followed. Malcolm didn't flinch. He had heard every kind of dismissal before. Too young, too quiet, too polished to be real, too black to win. He breathed in deeply. The scent of the courtroom always struck him. Polished wood, old paper, and something metallic beneath it all, like blood iron from long-decided battles. The American flag hung limp behind the bench, its stars dulled from years under fluorescent light. Justice, they said, was blind. But Malcolm had learned that sometimes she just refused to look in his direction. At 2:01 p.m., the gavel struck. The judge entered, robes flowing behind him like a shadow. His eyes briefly scanned the room, pausing for a moment too long when they landed on Malcolm. A flicker of surprise, maybe disdain, crossed the judge's face before it was masked by judicial neutrality. "Mr. Reed," the judge said, voice flat. "Are you prepared to proceed?" Malcolm stood, buttoned his jacket slowly, looked the judge in the eye. "Yes, Your Honor," he replied, voice steady. "We are ready." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. In that moment, something shifted. A few jurors leaned in. Cynthia exhaled for the first time in minutes, and somewhere, beneath layers of expectation and old prejudice, the courtroom tilted slightly in his favor. Just enough for a seed of doubt to be planted. This wasn't just another case. This was a reckoning. And Malcolm Reed, sharp and silent as a blade, was ready to carve truth out of injustice. The courtroom had barely settled before the judge's voice sliced through the quiet like a blade. "Mr. Reed," he said sharply, just as Malcolm began to outline the timeline of events leading to Cynthia Walters' termination. "Let's not waste the court's time with unnecessary backstory. Stick to the facts that matter." Malcolm paused mid-sentence. The interruption was abrupt, pointed. His jaw tightened slightly, but he kept his voice calm. "With all due respect, Your Honor, this context directly relates to the sequence of discriminatory actions." "You've made your point," the judge snapped, leaning forward. "Let's move along. We have a full docket and I expect efficiency." The tone wasn't explosive, not rude by legal standards, but there was something chilling about it, coated in the kind of authority that rarely needed to yell to crush. A few jurors exchanged glances. One woman in the back row looked down at her notebook, pretending to take notes, though her hand hadn't moved. Malcolm nodded once. "Understood." He continued his opening, adjusting course slightly but staying focused. Every word he chose was precise, every reference annotated with legal backing. He had spent weeks preparing, late nights, old case reviews, cross-referencing. Depositions, he wasn't just ready, he was over-ready, and still the interruptions came. "Is that speculation, counselor?" the judge asked as Malcolm quoted Cynthia's testimony about discriminatory remarks made by a supervisor. "No, Your Honor. It's based on a sworn deposition and corroborated by another employee's statement." Proceed with caution. The line between assumption and fact is thin, especially when emotions are involved. Emotions. The word hung in the air just long enough to sting. Malcolm didn't flinch, but his client Cynthia lowered her eyes as if suddenly ashamed of her own story. The defense attorney, Mr. Whitmore, sat across the aisle with a faint, practiced smirk, one hand lazily resting against his cheek as if to say, "Let the boy wear himself out." It was subtle, the judge's tone, his choice of words, the way he emphasized clarity and professionalism, as if only Malcolm needed the reminder. It was never outright hostile, never overtly racist. That was the trick of it. The condescension wore a robe and spoke with judicial polish, but it struck just the same. Malcolm took a breath. He felt the sting of every veiled jab. But he kept, his shoulders square, his speech even. He'd been here before, not in this courtroom perhaps, but in this position, the one where he had to prove not only his case but his right to be there. His right to speak without being corrected, to stand without being doubted. Each question from the bench came like a test disguised as a correction. "Mr. Reed, have you even reviewed the 2014 precedent on retaliation clauses, or would you like the court to recommend it to you?" Malcolm paused, calmly flipping to the exact page in his binder. "I have, Your Honor, page 218, subsection B. I'll be citing it shortly." The judge said nothing. He didn't need to. His silence carried a weight that said, "Don't get comfortable." And still Malcolm stood tall. There was a quiet murmur from the back bench, someone shifting in their seat, uncomfortable. The tension in the courtroom was thick, the kind that didn't come from drama but from something deeper, something uglier. A room full of people watching the performance of power, knowing there was no intermission. Cynthia turned to Malcolm once during a recess break, her voice low and unsure. "Do you think he doesn't want us to win?" Malcolm looked at her steady. "I think he's watching. I think they all are. So we show them what truth looks like when it doesn't stutter." She nodded, holding back tears. When court resumed, the pattern continued. Each time Malcolm gained ground, the judge found a way to slow him down, to cast a shadow of doubt. "Mr. Reed, I'd remind you, This court is not a place for grandstanding, the judge warned after a particularly passionate passage in Malcolm's argument. I'm here only to present the truth, Your Honor, Malcolm replied, measured. With respect, the facts may sound dramatic, but they are not dramatized. The air seemed to still. Even Whitmore looked up, a little surprised by the steel in Malcolm's voice. A few jurors straightened in their seats. Malcolm's words weren't angry, but they had weight, the kind that came from years of having to choose between silence and survival, and finally deciding neither was enough. The judge didn't respond. Instead, he looked down at his bench notes as if brushing the moment aside. But something in his jaw tightened. Something had shifted. For the rest of that session, he interrupted Malcolm less. Not because he suddenly respected him, but because, perhaps, he had finally seen him. Malcolm walked out of the courtroom that day feeling the invisible bruises of the battle. Not a battle over evidence or legal precedent, but over space, over presence. He hadn't raised his voice once, but he had defended more than his client. He had defended himself, his right to stand unshaken even under a gaze designed to make him fold, and he hadn't folded. The courtroom was quiet, save for the faint ticking of the antique clock on the far wall. Afternoon light spilled through the tall windows, casting sharp lines across the wooden floor, bright gold divided by long shadows. Malcolm Reed stood calmly in front of the witness stand. His hands were lightly clasped behind his back, the edge of his file folder tucked neatly beneath one arm. His voice had softened, slowed, not out of uncertainty, but deliberation. Mr. Hensley, Malcolm said, addressing the East Grove HR director who now sat in the witness chair. You testified that the restructuring which led to my client's termination was based solely on performance metrics, correct? Hensley shifted in his seat. Yes, that's correct. No consideration of race, gender, or age factored into your decision-making process? None whatsoever. Malcolm nodded thoughtfully. Interesting. He turned back to his table and leafed through a set of papers, taking just a beat longer than necessary. The audience watched in stillness like chess spectators waiting to see whether the next move was a feint or a checkmate. Then Malcolm pulled a document from the file, held it up, and approached the witness. Mr. Hensley, are you familiar with a case titled Jameson versus Chartham Textiles, filed in this very state 25 years ago? The courtroom blinked. Even the judge glanced up from his bench. Hensley furrowed his brow. No, I don't believe I am. Malcolm's tone remained neutral, but the edge was undeniable. Interesting, because in that case, the HR department of a large manufacturing company used identical language to justify the firing of a black employee, right down to the phrase, failure to meet evolving standards. There was a pause, subtle but deep. A few heads turned in the audience. A reporter's pen suddenly picked up speed. The judge leaned forward. Mr. Reed, he said slowly, is this line of questioning relevant to the case at hand? Malcolm didn't break eye contact with the judge. Your Honor, I believe it will be. I'm drawing a pattern not only of language but of institutional practice. Proceed cautiously, the judge said, though his voice had lost its earlier venom. Now there was curiosity beneath the stern mask. Cynthia turned her head slightly, brows knit with confusion. Her hand instinctively reached for Malcolm's sleeve under the table as he walked past, but she didn't stop him. He didn't look back. He knew she didn't understand where he was going with this, but she trusted him. Malcolm turned back to the jury and his voice rose, not in volume, but in depth. In Jameson versus Chartham Textiles, the plaintiff, a black man, was fired during a so-called departmental optimization. It was later revealed that his position had been reassigned to a less qualified white employee 2 weeks later. The HR director in that case submitted testimony stating the decision was purely statistical. He paused. Sound familiar? The jurors leaned in. A middle-aged man in the front row squinted as if trying to pull a memory forward. Malcolm continued, laying another file onto the overhead projector. The scanned page of an old deposition flickered onto the screen. It was grainy, but the words were clear. I would like to enter into evidence this deposition, dated March 1999. Malcolm said, his voice calm but taut with energy, in which the HR director admits under oath that he was instructed to cite performance issues when eliminating minority employees. The defense objected, of course. Whitmore rose, indignant, claiming irrelevance and misdirection. But Malcolm was ready. He handed the judge a page from the deposition with a small sticky tab at the bottom. Your Honor, I understand this case may seem unrelated, but allow me to read just one line. The judge hesitated. One line. Malcolm read it aloud, his voice ringing clearly through the courtroom. If we use the same words, no one will look too closely. Just say it's about performance. There was a collective shift in the room, a chill despite the sun filtering through the high windows. Even the court clerk had stopped typing. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Malcolm said, turning slowly to face them now. It is no coincidence that corporations recycle the same language to excuse the same injustice. Because language is camouflage. And we've been trained not to question it. Cynthia's eyes widened. She still didn't understand all the details. But something deep in her gut told her that Malcolm wasn't just building a case. He was building a story that had been erased too many times before. Malcolm let the moment hang, then turned back to the witness. Mr. Hensley, can you tell me definitively that no one in your department referenced this older case or adopted similar justification strategies in developing the restructuring? I don't know. That was decades ago. Exactly, Malcolm said softly. And still it echoes. The judge didn't interrupt this time. He was listening. The courtroom wasn't just watching a lawyer present a case anymore. They were watching him peel back a curtain. And behind it, something bigger was beginning to stir. Malcolm returned to his seat in silence. But the silence felt different now. It wasn't the silence of dismissal. It was the silence that comes before something breaks. The afternoon light had shifted to a dim amber now, casting long shadows across the courtroom floor. Dust motes danced in the beams near the windows, undisturbed and unnoticed, until Malcolm spoke again. He rose from his seat, file in hand, and walked slowly toward the center of the room. His steps were quiet, his expression unreadable. A stillness had settled over the courtroom. Even Whitmore, the defense attorney, had stopped scribbling notes. The judge watched Malcolm with a faint furrow in his brow, unsure of what was coming, but sensing its weight. Malcolm took his place before the jury and held up a thin, yellowed document, a photocopy worn at the corners, its ink faded but still legible. It looked out of place among the crisp, digital evidence and high-resolution court exhibits. This, Malcolm began, his voice steady and low, is a transcript from a trial that took place in this very courtroom 27 years ago. He turned slightly toward the judge's bench. Your Honor, you may remember it. The judge stiffened, his gaze narrowing. It was Andrews versus Briarwood & Co. The plaintiff was a young black woman named Elaine Andrews. She was fired without cause, after reporting repeated instances of racial harassment by her supervisor. The court appointed a defense attorney for her. That attorney stood right here where I'm standing now. Malcolm let the silence stretch. A few people in the courtroom shifted, suddenly alert. May I approach the bench, Your Honor? He asked. The judge hesitated, then gave a curt nod. Malcolm stepped forward, his footsteps measured. He handed the judge a copy of the transcript, then returned to his place before the jury. I'd like to read an excerpt from the closing argument in that case, Malcolm said. The defense attorney, then just starting his career, said something that has been quoted in at least 4 law schools and cited in 2 legal journals. He flipped the page and looked down, his voice softening as he read. Justice does not come easy. It does not favor comfort or familiarity. It requires courage, and it demands that we speak up when it's inconvenient and stand up for those who have been silenced. The words echoed across the courtroom like a hymn in a church that had long forgotten its faith. Nobody moved. Not the jury, not the defense, not even the judge. Malcolm paused, then looked up. I read those words for the first time as a second-year law student. They were printed in the margin of a civil rights casebook. footnoted with the name of a young public defender who, despite pressure from his own firm, took a stand no one else would. He turned to face the judge fully now. They were yours, Your Honor. The judge's face didn't change, but his eyes did. For a split second, something flickered behind them. Recognition, memory, maybe even shame. I became a lawyer because of that quote, Malcolm continued, his voice unwavering, because I believed that if a man could say that, then justice still had a voice worth listening to. And if justice had a voice, then people like Cynthia Walters had a chance. The room was breathless. A quiet hung in the air so heavy it felt like no one dared inhale. Your Honor, I know I am not the most experienced attorney to walk into this courtroom. I know I don't come from the same schools or firms as Mr. Whitmore. I know what I look like and how that looks to people who carry different expectations. I've felt that weight every day of this trial. His eyes never left the judge's. But I also know that justice isn't about who's most comfortable in this room. It's about who's willing to speak when silence is easier. He looked around, his gaze sweeping the faces of the jury. I didn't come here to challenge the court. I came here to remind it of what it already knows, of what it once was. Then, gently, he placed the transcript down on the table beside him. No theatrics, no raised voice, just truth. The judge said nothing, but his hand, resting on the edge of the bench, had curled into a slow, deliberate fist. For a long moment, no one moved. No papers rustled. Even the courtroom's old clock seemed to have paused between ticks. Cynthia sat in stunned silence, her hands folded tightly in her lap, eyes glistening. The jury, once half distracted, now leaned forward with collective focus, as if they, too, were remembering something they hadn't known they'd forgotten. The silence wasn't awkward. It was reverent. And in it, Malcolm stood, not as a man defending a case, but as someone delivering a verdict of his own. A verdict on memory. A verdict on courage. A verdict on the past refusing to stay buried and instead standing tall in a suit of quiet dignity. The silence that followed Malcolm's words was unlike anything the courtroom had heard all day. Not the hush of anticipation, not the pause between testimonies, but the kind of silence that comes when something ancient and sacred is suddenly remembered. The judge sat motionless behind the bench, his fingers no longer gripping his gavel but resting flat against the dark mahogany. His once stern face was drained of color. His mouth was slightly open, but no words came. He looked down at the transcript that Malcolm had placed before him moments earlier. The faint lines of age across his brow deepened. He didn't need to reread it. He knew the words. He had written them, spoken them, believed them. Once. Malcolm, still standing tall, though the strain was visible now in his shoulders, allowed the moment to settle. His eyes were steady, but his breath came just a touch quicker. A faint pulse beat in his temple. He spoke again, not loudly, but with the force of conviction sharpened by decades of history. If those words no longer hold meaning to you, your honor, Malcolm said, his voice unwavering, then I ask this court to tell me what justice truly is today. It landed like a final stone thrown into a still pond. Even Whitmore, the opposing counsel, who had spent most of the trial, puffed. With arrogant certainty, now sat rigid in his chair. His pen had fallen to the table. His jaw was tight, as if clenching against a truth too bitter to swallow. Cynthia Walters looked at Malcolm as though seeing him for the first time. Not just her attorney, not just her defender, but the very embodiment of what she had hoped for. When she stepped into this fight, a voice willing to speak when hers had been ignored. A reporter at the back of the courtroom had stopped typing, hands frozen above the keyboard. The jurors' expressions ranged from stunned to sorrowful. Some leaned forward, others glanced furtively at the judge, awaiting something, anything. But no words came. The judge slowly lifted his eyes from the page. For a brief, flickering moment, his gaze softened, not enough to show remorse, but enough to reveal a crack, a memory, a reckoning. His lips parted slightly, as if he might speak. But then he stopped. Instead, he drew a long, silent breath and looked out over the courtroom. Then, with a small, tired nod, he gestured to the bailiff. "Proceed," he said. "Just one word. No rebuke, no redirection, no more interruptions. Just proceed." And that was enough. It was more powerful than any outburst, more honest than a forced apology. It was the silence of a man realizing that the idealism he once carried had been buried under robes and routine. And now, that idealism stood before him in the form of a man half his age, holding up a mirror. Malcolm returned quietly to his seat. The floorboards creaked beneath his step. He glanced at Cynthia, who gave him a single shaky nod. Her eyes brimmed with something too complex for just gratitude. It was respect, and it was hope. The jury took it in, all of it, the twist, the silence, the reminder that beneath all the legal procedures and cold formalities, they were here for something larger than a verdict. Malcolm didn't speak again that day. He didn't need to. From that moment forward, the trial shifted. The temperature in the room changed, not just metaphorically, but tangibly. Even the light felt different, warmer, as if something heavy had been lifted. Whitmore faltered during his next cross-examination. He stammered slightly, lost his rhythm, as though he could feel the courtroom's unspoken judgment hanging over him. The jurors, many of whom had looked at Malcolm with neutral expressions earlier, now watched him with a different kind of attentiveness. Respect had taken root where skepticism once lived. And the judge? He didn't interrupt Malcolm again. He didn't look him in the eye either. But when he handed down rulings, they came with a noticeable precision, as though he were now acutely aware that every word, every gesture would be remembered. Malcolm sat still for the remainder of the proceedings, calm, focused. But there was a quiet storm beneath his stillness, a fire he had long kept contained. Not out of fear, but out of discipline, out of knowing the world would watch for a misstep and call it weakness. But today, he hadn't needed to shout. He hadn't needed to fight back in the way the world expected him to. He had done something more dangerous. He had reminded them of who they used to be, and in doing so, he reminded them of who they still could become. 2 days later, the courtroom was full again, but this time, the tension had changed. The trial was over. The arguments had been made, the cross-examinations finished. Now, only the verdict remained. Malcolm sat at the plaintiff's table beside Cynthia Walters. She gripped a tissue in one hand, the other resting gently on the table's edge. Her nails trembled slightly. The weeks of strain of being doubted and devalued had worn her down. But today, her eyes held something brighter. Expectation, and something else too. Belief. The jury forewoman, a middle-aged woman in a navy blazer, rose with the paper in her hand. She didn't smile. She didn't glance at the judge. She looked straight ahead as she spoke. "We, the jury, find in favor of the plaintiff." A brief pause. Then, unanimously. The words hit the room like sunlight through a storm. Cynthia gasped, tears already forming. She turned to Malcolm, who remained still for a moment, just breathing. He nodded once, then leaned in gently, saying something only she could hear. She nodded back, wiping her eyes. The judge, eyes downcast, offered a brief closing and dismissed. The jury with mechanical formality. The trial was done. But the echoes of what had happened in that room would last much longer. Outside, the courthouse steps were flanked by cameras and clusters of onlookers. Reporters from local outlets to national publications had gathered, tipped off after word of the explosive courtroom exchange had made its way across legal blogs and social media. When Malcolm finally stepped outside with Cynthia at his side, microphones surged toward him like a tide. He raised a hand, not to wave them off, but to hold space. "Mr. Reed," someone called. "How did you manage to keep your composure after the judge's treatment earlier in the trial?" Another shouted. "Did you plan that revelation about the judge's past? Was it a strategy?" Malcolm looked over the crowd, Then up at the courthouse steps behind him, at the old stone, the carved pillars, the building that had once tried to hold him in silence. He stepped forward. Dignity, he said slowly, clearly, isn't silence. It's knowing when to speak so the truth echoes louder than hate. The crowd hushed. Cameras clicked, but no one interrupted. I didn't come to court to embarrass anyone. I didn't come to remind the judge of his better days just for drama. I came here because a woman, my client, was told she didn't matter. Because justice is not just a process, it's a promise. And I intend to keep it. He turned slightly toward Cynthia, who was now holding his arm. She matters. They all do. Reporters lowered their microphones. The story had already written itself. As the crowd began to disperse, Malcolm stepped to the side, watching a father guide his young son past the courthouse steps. The boy stopped, staring at Malcolm for a moment. He tugged his father's sleeve. Is he the lawyer? The boy asked. The father nodded, and for a second, Malcolm caught the man's eyes. No words passed between them, just a nod. A silent thank you, spoken across generations. Later that evening, Malcolm returned to his modest apartment in a quieter part of the city. The courtroom felt far away now, replaced by the soft ticking of the old clock in his hallway. He hung his jacket, loosened his tie, and sat on the worn leather couch by the window. He opened a book, not to read, but to remember. Inside the front cover was a single quote, underlined in fading ink. Justice means speaking up when it's inconvenient, and standing up for those who've been silenced. He had once read it with the wide-eyed hunger of a young man who wanted to believe in heroes. Today he read it knowing that heroes don't always look like the stories say they do. Sometimes they wear quiet suits. Sometimes they bleed in silence. And sometimes they speak not to be heard, but to be remembered. Justice wasn't about shouting louder than the other side. It was about refusing to disappear. Moral lesson. In a world that often speaks over the unheard, dignity is not found in silence, but in the strength to rise, speak truth, and remind others of their own forgotten convictions. Justice is not always won in thunder. It is sometimes claimed in the stillness after a voice refuses to tremble.